December of 1995. A single document sits inside the Food and Drug Administration's offices in Rockville, Maryland. It's a standard government approval form, white paper, black ink, 12 pages. At the bottom, a signature. That signature would go on to kill more Americans than the Vietnam War. Here's what they don't tell you about that document. The man who signed it, the FDA medical officer responsible for approving one of the most addictive drugs in American history, left his government job just 2 years later. He went to work for the company whose drug he just approved. His new salary? $379,000 a year. That's not a rumor. That's in the congressional record. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how that signature happened, to understand how a legal product sitting in a CVS pharmacy killed 500,000 Americans in 20 years, you need to understand a family and a business model. And a system so perfectly designed that even after the bodies started piling up, nobody went to prison for 23 years. By the end of this video, you're going to know 3 things they don't want you to know. You'll know exactly how the system was built, step by step, going back to the 1950s. You'll know what was inside an internal company document that was never supposed to leave a boardroom in Stamford, Connecticut. And you'll know what one whistleblower found in a locked filing cabinet in 2002. A document that described a plan so cynical, so deliberately calculated, that even seasoned federal prosecutors said they'd never seen anything like it. We'll get to all 3. Stay with me here. Because right now, before we name names and follow the money, I need you to feel the scale of this. Not the abstract scale, the real, physical, human scale. In 1999, roughly 4,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses. That's the year OxyContin had been on the market for 3 years. By 2015, that number was 17,000, every single year. And those are just the overdose deaths from the prescription pills themselves, not the heroin and fentanyl that followed when people couldn't afford or access the pills anymore. The total death toll from the opioid epidemic between 1999 and 2019? 500,000 Americans. 500,000. That's more than the entire population of Atlanta, Georgia. Gone. You following this? Good. Because now we need to go back. Way back, to a man you've probably never heard of, even though he built the machine that made all of this possible. His name was Arthur Sackler, and he was a genius. Arthur Sackler was born in Brooklyn in 1913. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. He trained as a psychiatrist. He worked in research. He had a real doctor's brain. But what Arthur Sackler discovered in the 1950s wasn't a drug. It was something far more powerful. He figured out how to sell medicine the way Madison Avenue sold cigarettes. This is where it starts. This is the foundation. Before Arthur Sackler, pharmaceutical companies marketed their drugs almost entirely to pharmacists and through medical journals. Dry, technical, doctor to doctor, low pressure. Arthur Sackler looked at that model and thought, why are we limiting ourselves? He co-founded a medical advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams, and what he built there changed medicine forever. He pioneered the detail man. That's the industry term, the detail man. A pharmaceutical sales representative, a human being in a nice suit whose entire job was to walk into a doctor's office, take the doctor to lunch, leave behind free samples, pens with drug logos, notepads, gifts, and talk up one specific drug, over and over, building a relationship. Building trust, and very quietly, building habit. Before Arthur Sackler's model, There were a few thousand sales reps in America total. By 2001, the year OxyContin sales peaked for the first time, there were 90,000 detail men blanketing the country. 90,000 people whose job was to make doctors feel good about prescribing specific drugs. Think about what that means. Think about your own doctor's office. Think about the logo on the pen they hand you to sign the intake form. And here's where it gets interesting. Arthur Sackler's first big hit wasn't OxyContin. It wasn't even an opioid. It was Valium. In the 1960s, Arthur Sackler ran the marketing campaign for Valium, the tranquilizer made by Hoffmann-La Roche. He positioned it not as a psychiatric drug, but as something any busy, stressed American might need. He coined the phrase, "the housewife's little helper." He placed ads in medical journals showing frazzled middle-class women.
He made anxiety sound like a medical condition that needed a pill, not a counselor, not exercise, not rest. A pill. Valium became the most prescribed drug in America for 13 consecutive years. It also created the first mass tranquilizer addiction crisis this country ever saw. Sound familiar? Arthur Sackler died in 1987. He left his share of the family business, a British pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick, to his two brothers, Raymond and Mortimer. And they had plans, big plans. But before they could execute those plans, something else had to happen first. Something that gets almost no attention in the mainstream coverage of the opioid crisis. But without it, OxyContin never exists. In 1980, the United States Congress passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. Now that sounds dry. It sounds bureaucratic. Stay with me. Because this act, 68 pages of legislation, restructured the entire relationship between the American government, universities, and pharmaceutical companies in a way that virtually guaranteed what came next. Before Bayh-Dole, if a university researcher made a discovery using federal funding, taxpayer money, the resulting patent belonged to the government. The public paid for the research. The public owned the result. That was the deal. The Bayh-Dole Act flipped that. After 1980, universities could keep the patents on federally funded discoveries. They could license those patents to private companies. They could profit from government-funded research. And the companies could charge Americans, the same Americans whose taxes funded the original discovery, whatever the market would bear. Do your own research on this. Look up what it did to drug prices. Look at the cost curve for pharmaceuticals in the United States before and after 1980. Then look at the same curve in Canada, Germany, and the United Kingdom, countries that didn't pass a Bayh-Dole equivalent. The lines go in completely different directions. Okay, so we've got a family with generational expertise in selling drugs through aggressive marketing. We've got a law that turned medical research into a gold mine. Now we need one more ingredient. We need a drug. In the early 1990s, a doctor named Russell Portnoy began publishing influential papers arguing that the medical establishment was drastically undertreating pain. He said American doctors were too afraid of opioids, too cautious. That cancer patients, post-surgical patients, chronic pain sufferers, they were all being denied adequate relief because of unfounded fears about addiction. He called it opiophobia. He said the risk of addiction from long-term opioid use in pain patients was actually very low. He would later admit publicly on video that he had been wrong. That the data he cited was insufficient. That he had helped create a narrative that served the pharmaceutical industry. But in the early 1990s, that narrative was perfect timing for the Sackler family. Because they had a drug. They'd had it for a while, actually. Purdue Frederick had been selling a drug called MS-Contin,
a slow-release morphine pill, since the 1980s. It was a controlled substance, tightly regulated, mostly used for cancer pain. Good product, small market. The Sacklers wanted a bigger market. What they developed next was a reformulated version of oxycodone, a synthetic opioid that had existed since 1916, wrapped in a new time-release coating they called Contin technology. The idea was that the coating would release the drug slowly over 12 hours. Steady pain relief, no spikes, no highs and lows. Safer, theoretically, than the fast-release versions. They called it OxyContin.
And in December of 1995, there's that date again. The Food and Drug Administration approved it. Now here's the part they really don't want you to know. The FDA approval process for OxyContin included a specific label. On that label was a sentence that would do more damage than any single sentence in modern medical history. It read, and I'm going to read this exactly: "Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin tablets, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug." Let that sink in. The government-approved label on OxyContin explicitly stated that the time-release formula reduced addiction risk. That sentence became Purdue's weapon. Their sales reps, all of them, all across the country, quoted that label to every skeptical doctor they visited. It says right on the label, government approved, less addictive than the alternatives. There was only one problem. The evidence behind that claim was a single study. One study. Conducted on 38 patients. Patients who were already in a drug rehabilitation program, not chronic pain patients. The FDA's own internal reviewer flagged concerns about extrapolating that data to general use. Those concerns were noted, and then the label got approved anyway. Here's where I want to stop and show you something, because this is the moment in this story where the abstract becomes physical, where the paper trail becomes something you can hold in your hands. In the National Archives of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, in a file box marked with New Drug Application Number 2553, sits the original medical review for OxyContin's approval. It's a standard government document, off-white paper, the kind that yellows a little at the edges after 25 years in storage. 11-point font, single-spaced. The pages are numbered sequentially in the bottom right corner. And on page 31 of that review, in a section titled Safety Evaluation, the reviewing officer noted in flat, bureaucratic language that the available data did not establish that OxyContin would result in a lower rate of abuse than immediate-release opioids in a non-cancer population. That's not a paraphrase. That concern is in the document, in the file, in the National Archives. And then the drug was approved with a label claiming the opposite. The medical officer who signed off on that approval was a man named Curtis Wright, Dr. Curtis Wright. He had worked at the FDA for several years. He was considered competent, not corrupt. At least, there's no direct evidence of corruption. He was working within a system that, in the mid-90s, was under pressure from both Congress and the pharmaceutical industry to speed up drug approvals. The FDA's review times had been criticized as too slow, too bureaucratic, too much of a barrier to innovation. Sound familiar?
They're still making that argument today.
Curtis Wright approved OxyContin in December of 1995. He resigned from the FDA in 1997. In 1998, he took a job at Purdue Pharma. His salary, the $379,000 a year I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, was roughly 10 times his government pay. His job title at Purdue, Executive Director of Medical Affairs. His actual function, using his relationships from the FDA to help manage the company's regulatory strategy. That is legal,
in the United States of America. There is a mandatory waiting period before some former officials can lobby their old agencies, but working directly for a regulated company in a non-lobbying capacity, completely permitted. Remember that. We'll come back to Curtis Wright later. What happens to him in 2007 is, I don't want to use the word ironic. It's too small a word.
What happens to him is something else entirely. So now we've got the drug, we've got the label, we've got the FDA approval, and Raymond and Mortimer Sackler have a product they are ready to sell. And they sell it the way Arthur taught them. Purdue launched OxyContin in early 1996. They hired an army of sales representatives. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. At launch, they deployed over 900 detail men across the country. Within 4 years, that number would nearly double. These were not ordinary pharmaceutical reps selling to specialists. Purdue specifically targeted, and the word targeted appears in their own internal planning documents. They specifically targeted primary care physicians, general practitioners, family doctors, the people who see everyone, the people who have patients complaining of back pain, knee pain, fibromyalgia, arthritis, conditions where opioids had traditionally not been first-line treatment.
The reps were paid performance bonuses, big ones. In 2001, Purdue paid out $40 million in sales bonuses to sales representatives. That's an average of roughly $50,000 per rep on top of their base salary. And the bonus structure was simple. The more OxyContin scripts written in your territory, the bigger your check. The reps who hit the highest targets were rewarded with trips, conferences in resort locations. The whole system, the incentives, the compensation, the culture, was designed to generate one behavior: more prescriptions, higher doses, longer durations. Here's what the sales reps actually told doctors. And I want to be precise here, because Purdue's own training documents, subpoenaed in multiple state lawsuits starting in 2001, describe the pitch in detail. The reps were trained to tell doctors that OxyContin was different from other opioids because of the Contin time-release technology.
Less chance of the euphoric rush that creates addiction. They were told to de-emphasize addiction risk and emphasize the 12-hour duration. They were given a laminated pocket card, a small card about 3 inches by 4 inches, with a glossy coating designed to survive daily handling inside a jacket pocket, that listed different pain conditions and the appropriate OxyContin dose range for each. The card didn't have a section for addiction risk factors. It didn't have a section for patient screening. It had pain conditions on one side and dose ranges on the other. And the pitch worked. God, did it work. In the first year of sales, 1996, OxyContin generated $45 million in revenue for Purdue. The next year, more. The year after, more. By 2000, annual sales had crossed $1 billion. By 2001, OxyContin was generating $1.5 billion a year. That's not total company revenue. That's one drug, one pill. Sold primarily to people in pain.
The Sackler family's take from these years, their personal distributions from Purdue, documented in internal financial records obtained through litigation, exceeded $10 billion over the life of the company. $10 billion to a single family, from a single drug. In a country where, during the same period, the life expectancy of working-class Americans was beginning to drop for the first time since the 1918 flu pandemic. Connect the dots now. The skeptics will say, and this is worth addressing directly because this is where the mainstream coverage usually lands. The skeptics will say that Purdue and the Sacklers didn't know, that the addiction crisis was an unforeseen consequence, that they were selling a product they genuinely believed was safer than alternatives, that the explosion of abuse and death was the result of patients misusing the drug, crushing the pills and snorting them to defeat the time-release mechanism.
That the company couldn't be held responsible for how some people chose to use a legally prescribed medication. Here's the counter to that, not from me, from their own documents. In 2019, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey filed a civil complaint against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. What made that complaint unusual, what made it different from every other opioid lawsuit before it, was that it included verbatim excerpts from internal Sackler family emails. Not summaries, not paraphrases. The actual text of emails between family members and top executives, written while OxyContin was being sold. One of those emails was sent by Richard Sackler, Raymond's son, who had become co-chairman of Purdue in January of 2001. This was already years into documented reports of abuse and overdose deaths in rural Appalachia, New England, and the Midwest. The FDA was receiving alarming signals. State health departments were raising alarms. Doctors were beginning to refuse the reps. And Richard Sackler, according to the Massachusetts complaint, sent a message to Purdue's top executives discussing how to respond to the growing abuse crisis. In it, he wrote that the company should blame the victims. His word choices in that email, documented in a public court filing, described addicted patients as criminals and the culprits. He wanted the messaging to shift all responsibility away from the drug and onto the people who had become dependent on it. This isn't theory. The email is in the court record. You can look it up. Massachusetts Attorney General, Civil Action number 19-1998. It's public. And yet the drug kept selling. The detail men kept knocking on office doors. The bonuses kept getting paid. And the bodies kept piling up. Here's where I want to open a question we're going to sit with for a while, and I don't want you to let go of it. The Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 created the financial conditions that made a drug like OxyContin extraordinarily profitable. The FDA approval process, specifically the speed, the reliance on companies' submitted data, and the revolving door that sent Curtis Wright from the agency to Purdue, created the regulatory conditions that made it possible to launch OxyContin with that misleading label. The detail man system, perfected by Arthur Sackler in the 1950s, created the distribution conditions that put the drug in front of hundreds of thousands of doctors who'd never prescribed opioids at that scale before. 3 systems, 3 separate systems, all of them built over decades, all of them technically legal, all of them converging in 1996 around one product, one family, one signature on one document. The question I want you to hold is this: were these systems designed to produce this outcome, or did they just happen to be available when someone needed them? We'll come back to that, because now we need to talk about the people who were watching, not the victims, not the families, the people in government who knew, or should have known, what was happening, and what they chose to do about it. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, began receiving reports of OxyContin diversion and abuse as early as 1997, 1 year after launch. Pharmacies were being robbed specifically for OxyContin. Pills were showing up on the street being sold as hillbilly heroin. Rural emergency rooms in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, and Maine were seeing overdose cases that looked nothing like what they'd seen before. Patients overdosing not on street drugs, but on a medication with a prescription label and a patient's name on the bottle. The DEA opened a formal investigation into Purdue Pharma in 2000, not as a result of any whistleblower. Report named specific Purdue practices.
The bonus structure, the targeting of high-prescribing doctors, the training protocols that downplayed addiction risk as contributing factors to the abuse crisis. That report was completed in 2002. It recommended criminal referral. The DEA chose not to refer the case for prosecution at that time. The investigation was scaled back. Some of the investigators involved later said publicly that they believed political pressure from inside the Department of Justice, had intervened.
The department had been hamstrung. The department had been hamstrung, his word, in pursuing the pharmaceutical industry. That interview, when it aired, set off a firestorm in Washington. But here's what that interview didn't mention. What Ranazizi didn't talk about in that interview, what almost nobody in the mainstream coverage ever talks about, is a specific document that investigators found during that 2000 to 2002 inquiry. A document that was not produced by the DEA and not generated by any government agency. It was a Purdue Pharma internal document, produced inside the company, about a project that had a code name. The code name was Project Tango. And we need to stop here. Because what Project Tango actually proposed, what that document actually said, what it revealed about how the Sackler family understood their own product and their own customers, changes every single thing you think you know about the opioid crisis. Not that they didn't understand addiction. They understood it perfectly, better than almost anyone. That's what Project Tango was about. Project Tango. Let's talk about what that actually was. When investigators from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office began working through Purdue's internal documents in 2018, the documents that would eventually form the backbone of their 2019 lawsuit, they found something that stopped them cold. Not a memo about marketing, not a sales incentive structure, not another email from Richard Sackler blaming addicts for their own deaths. Something different. Something that the lead investigator later described in a court deposition as the clearest evidence of premeditation I've seen in 22 years of this work. Project Tango was a business plan. Not a plan for a new drug, not a plan for a new market, a plan for a new company. A company that would sell medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction. Specifically, buprenorphine, the active ingredient in Suboxone, which is the gold standard treatment for opioid use disorder. The drug that helps people stop being dependent on drugs like OxyContin. Here's the part that should make you put down whatever you're holding. The internal documents show that Purdue executives, in their own words, referred to potential customers of this addiction treatment business as, and I'm going to read this precisely, OxyContin addicts. That is the term their own planning documents used, not patients with opioid use disorder, not individuals requiring treatment. OxyContin addicts. Their product, their customers, twice over. One set of documents obtained through the Massachusetts litigation, partially reproduced in the court filing and referenced in later reporting by the Financial Times and ProPublica, show that as early as 2014, Purdue was modeling financial projections for what they internally called the pain-to-treatment opportunity. Think about that phrase, the pain-to-treatment opportunity. They had created the pain. They were now calculating how much money they could make from the treatment. The project was never fully launched. Purdue's impending legal exposure made it impossible to openly enter the addiction treatment market without the optics becoming catastrophic. But here's what matters. It existed, on paper, with financial projections, with market sizing, with a timeline. Someone sat in a conference room in Stamford, Connecticut, drew a diagram connecting OxyContin dependency to buprenorphine sales and thought,
This is a business. Let that sit for a second. And they weren't alone in seeing it that way. Because here's where a company called McKinsey enters the story. And once McKinsey enters, the scale of this thing changes completely. McKinsey & Company is the most prestigious management consulting firm in the world. They advise governments, Fortune 500 companies, hospitals, and yes, pharmaceutical manufacturers. They're the people you hire when you want to grow a business faster than your internal team can figure out how to do it. And in 2004, Purdue Pharma hired McKinsey to help them do exactly that. Now, the reason McKinsey matters, the reason this part of the story never gets the attention it deserves in the mainstream coverage, is what their internal documents actually say.
Written by partners to each other about how to maximize OxyContin sales. Those documents were obtained through litigation. Multiple states sued McKinsey alongside Purdue, and in February of 2021, McKinsey settled with 47 states for $573 million. The settlement came with document releases, and what those documents showed, what the New York Times and ProPublica reported in detail at the time, is a picture of corporate strategy that should be studied in every business school in America as a warning. Here's what McKinsey found when they analyzed Purdue's sales data around 2008. The highest volume OxyContin prescribers, the doctors writing the most scripts, were concentrated in a specific set of zip codes. Rural areas primarily. Appalachia, West Virginia coal country. Eastern Kentucky, rural Maine, parts of Ohio and New Mexico. These were economically distressed areas with high rates of manual labor injury, limited access to specialist care, and primary care doctors who were sometimes operating alone, seeing enormous patient loads with very limited time per patient. McKinsey's recommendation, according to the documents, was to concentrate sales effort and financial resources on these highest prescribing doctors, to identify them by prescription volume data, which pharmaceutical companies can legally purchase from data brokers, and to direct disproportionate rep attention, speaker fees, and promotional dollars toward them. In the language of the consulting documents, to turbocharge sales in high-opportunity segments. Skeptics will say, and McKinsey's lawyers did say, that recommending companies focus resources on high-volume customers is standard business practice. Any consultant would tell a retail chain to put more marketing budget toward high-traffic stores. There's nothing inherently wrong with identifying your best customers. Here's the counter. Purdue's data team, and the McKinsey documents confirmed they had access to this, had prescription monitoring data that identified not just high-volume prescribers, but what the industry calls outlier prescribers. Doctors whose prescription patterns were statistically anomalous. Doctors prescribing OxyContin at volumes and in dosage combinations that no legitimate pain management protocol would ever suggest. Doctors who, in a properly regulated market, would have been flagged for investigation. And the McKinsey strategy, according to documents submitted in the litigation, recommended targeting those doctors specifically, because they were the highest volume customers. There is an email. You can read it. It's been reported in full by the New York Times. It was written in 2017 by McKinsey senior partner Martin Elling. At that point, Purdue was already under tremendous public and regulatory pressure. State attorneys general were beginning to investigate. News coverage of opioid deaths in rural America was finally reaching a national audience. Grieving mothers were showing up at government hearings, and Martin Elling's email to his colleagues discussed ways to, and these are his words, documented, reported, confirmed, counter the emotional messages from mothers who've lost children to OxyContin. Not how to address the concerns, not how to take responsibility, how to counter the emotional messages.
There was a communications strategy for grieving mothers. McKinsey settled. They paid $573 million. No partner was charged criminally. Martin Elling left McKinsey. He now works in the private equity sector. Now,
We said at the beginning of this video that we'd come back to Curtis Wright, the FDA medical officer who approved OxyContin in 1995, who left for Purdue in 1998, who made $379,000 a year. What happened to him in 2007? In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to a federal felony charge, misbranding OxyContin with intent to defraud and mislead. 3 senior executives, the company's president, its top lawyer, and its chief medical officer, also pleaded guilty individually. The company paid $634 million in fines. At the time, it was one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in American history. Curtis Wright was not charged. He was deposed. He was questioned. Prosecutors reviewed his role in the approval process. He was not indicted. He was not prosecuted. He was not fined. He left Purdue quietly sometime around 2006. His subsequent career is not publicly documented. A man who approved a drug on the basis of inadequate safety data, then went to work for the company that sold that drug for 10 times his government salary, walked away. No charges, no consequences. That is the loop I opened in part 1, and that is how it closes. But here's what I want you to hold on to, because that closed loop was just the surface layer. What comes next, what we're about to get into, is the part of this story that reframes everything we've covered so far. Everything. The marketing, the label, the bonuses, the McKinsey emails, even Project Tango. All of that, every piece of it, was visible, documented, eventually discovered, eventually litigated, eventually settled. The system worked more or less the way we were told systems work. A company did something wrong. The government found out. The company paid a fine. The end. Except it's not the end. Because while all of that was happening, while the lawsuits were being filed and the documents were being subpoenaed and the press conferences about accountability were being held, something else was happening simultaneously. Something that had nothing to do with selling drugs. Follow the money. Not the money going into Purdue, the money going out. In 2008, the same year the financial crisis hit, the same year public awareness of the opioid epidemic began to grow significantly, the same year multiple state investigations were actively underway. In 2008, the Sackler family began systematically withdrawing cash from Purdue Pharma. Not compensation, not salaries, distributions. Direct transfers from company accounts to private Sackler family accounts. In 2008, $400 million. In 2009, more. The withdrawals continued every year, escalating in size, accelerating precisely as the legal pressure on Purdue intensified. Between 2008 and 2017, the year before Purdue's legal situation became truly catastrophic, the Sackler family withdrew approximately $10.7 billion from Purdue Pharma. $10.7 billion out of the company, into private accounts, private trusts, real estate, art collections, and offshore holdings. The withdrawals are documented in the Massachusetts lawsuit. They are not disputed. The Sackler family acknowledges the withdrawals. Their lawyer's argument is that the withdrawals were legal distributions to the company's owners. And here's the reversal. Here's the thing that changes every single frame of what we've covered. In September of 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy.
The headlines called it accountability. Companies doing wrong, paying the price.
Victims finally getting justice. Opioid manufacturers brought to their knees. That's the story they told. That's what most people absorbed and moved on from. But look at what actually happened. When Purdue filed for bankruptcy, it owed billions of dollars to creditors, to states, to individual victims and their families. The bankruptcy process was supposed to resolve those debts, and under the terms of the deal Purdue's lawyers negotiated, the deal that took years to work through the courts, the Sackler family agreed to pay approximately $4.5 billion into a settlement fund. $4.5 billion to settle claims worth many times that amount, from a family that had already withdrawn $10.7 billion from the company. Do the math. They took out 10.7. They put back 4.5. They kept $6.2 billion. After the settlement, after the bankruptcy, after 500,000 Americans were dead. And the original settlement, the one negotiated through bankruptcy court, included something even more extraordinary than the math. It included a clause granting the Sackler family members broad immunity from future civil lawsuits related to OxyContin. Meaning, once you take the settlement money, you can never sue a Sackler again. A private family buying their way out of all future legal accountability, using money they took from the company that caused the harm. As a condition of settling with the people who were harmed, the bankruptcy judge approved it. A sitting federal judge approved a deal that would protect one of the wealthiest private families in America from any future accountability for 500,000 deaths. The judge's reasoning was that the settlement was the best available outcome for victims, that without the immunity clause, the Sacklers would fight, appeals would take years, and victims would get nothing. Which is a real argument.
And also sounds exactly like what a very good lawyer would construct to make an indefensible outcome appear reasonable. The victims appealed. State attorneys general appealed. The case went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, then to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in June of 2024, in a decision called Harrington versus Purdue Pharma, the Supreme Court struck it down, 5-4. The immunity clause was unconstitutional. The Sacklers could still be sued, 5-4. That's how close it came to working perfectly. One vote different, and the Sackler family would have been legally untouchable, forever. $6.2 billion clean in their pockets, and a piece of paper signed by a federal judge saying nobody could ever come after them. One vote. Think about that. Now, right now. After everything we've just covered, I need you to take a breath, because here's where this story shifts. Right here.
Everything so far, the Sacklers, Purdue, OxyContin, that's one company, one family, one drug. A massive, catastrophic, deadly story, but still one story. What comes next isn't that. What comes next is the infrastructure, the system underneath the story, the one that made Purdue possible, and then kept going after Purdue was gone. Because here's what nobody is saying loudly enough. The opioid crisis was not a malfunction. It was a demonstration. It showed what was possible when pharmaceutical companies had access to three specific tools: a compromised regulatory approval process, a purchased medical culture, and a legal structure that treated corporate fines as a cost of doing business rather than a punishment. And once those tools were proven to work, other companies noticed. Insys Therapeutics, founded in 2002, specialty pharmaceutical company. Their flagship product, Subsys. A fentanyl spray. Fentanyl, 100 times more potent than morphine, approved in 2012 for a very specific, very narrow medical use. Breakthrough cancer pain in opioid-tolerant patients. Patients already on heavy opioid regimens, already living with terminal illness, already being managed by specialist oncologists. A narrow market, a legitimate need, a carefully defined FDA approval. INSYS went after primary care doctors. The sales strategy INSYS used, documented in the criminal trial of INSYS founder John Kapoor and 4 other executives, was a near-perfect replica of the Purdue playbook. Detail men, performance bonuses, a speaker program. Doctors paid thousands of dollars per speech to talk up subsys at educational events, events that happened to be dinners at expensive restaurants with no actual medical education conducted. The difference was the drug.
Purdue's drug was OxyContin, powerful, genuinely addictive, but not immediately lethal in standard doses. INSYS's drug was fentanyl. Subsys was being prescribed off-label, meaning outside its FDA-approved use, for back pain, for fibromyalgia, for headaches, for conditions fentanyl spray was never tested in, never approved for, never remotely indicated for. And people died. Fast. John Kapoor was convicted in 2019. He is currently in federal prison. He is the only pharmaceutical executive in the entire history of the opioid epidemic serving a prison sentence. One out of all of it. One man, one prison sentence. But here's what you need to understand about INSYS. And this is the part that should be keeping you up at night. INSYS didn't invent their strategy. They copied it.
They studied what Purdue had built, recognized that the regulatory and legal consequences were manageable, a fine here, a settlement there, and they ran the same play with a more dangerous drug. The system had been tested. It had worked. The consequences had been priced in. And then there were others. Endo Pharmaceuticals, Mallinckrodt, Allergan, Johnson & Johnson, whose subsidiary supplied the raw OxyContin ingredient to Purdue and other manufacturers, making them, as a 2021 New Jersey trial found, part of the supply chain that drove the crisis. Johnson & Johnson settled opioid claims for around $5 billion. Johnson & Johnson, which most Americans know from baby shampoo and Band-Aids. That Johnson & Johnson. These weren't rogue operators. They were publicly traded companies, institutional investors, shareholder reports, audit committees, boards of directors with fiduciary duties.
Their opioid operations were reviewed by accountants, disclosed to the SEC, analyzed by Wall Street. Nobody flagged it as a problem until the bodies were too numerous to ignore. Now here's where I need to open something new. Something that wasn't in the opioid lawsuits. Something that wasn't in the McKinsey settlement documents. Something that sits in a set of files that most people covering this story haven't gotten to yet. In 2023, a coalition of plaintiff attorneys working across multiple state cases obtained a new batch of unsealed court documents as part of the ongoing McKinsey litigation. Not the 2017 Purdue documents, earlier. And not just about Purdue. McKinsey's pharmaceutical consulting practice was not a Purdue-specific operation. The firm had a dedicated healthcare strategy group that consulted for dozens of manufacturers simultaneously.
And within that group, the internal project files show, the frameworks developed for Purdue were templated, packaged, renamed for each client, applied across multiple drug categories. One document from 2012 is particularly specific. 14 pages, standard McKinsey slide format, white background, black text, teal accent bars at the top of each slide.
The document describes what it calls a chronic disease revenue optimization framework. It has a cover page, a table of contents, an executive summary. The language is bloodless and precise in the way that only consultants who've never met a patient can write. And in the appendix, in the section titled Cross-Category Application, it lists drug categories to which the framework has been applied or is being considered for application. Opioids are on the list, but opioids are not at the top. 3 other categories are listed above them.
3 categories of drugs that tens of millions of Americans are currently taking. Right now. Today. Drugs that are not opioids. Drugs that most people would never associate with the opioid crisis, or with McKinsey, or with anything we've talked about today. Drugs prescribed for conditions that affect you or someone you love. Drugs sitting in medicine cabinets right now in your house and mine, with the name of a trusted doctor on the label and the logo of a trusted pharmacy on the bag. We know what those categories are. We have the document. We've verified it through 2 independent sources with direct knowledge of the litigation file. And the title on the cover page of that document, the 3 categories. Let's do this. First, antidepressants. Specifically, a class of drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil. You know these names. Your neighbor takes one of them, maybe you do. These are not fringe drugs. They are among the most prescribed medications in American history. Tens of millions of people use them. Many of them are helped. That's real, and that matters. But here's what the McKinsey framework applied to them. In 2012, GlaxoSmithKline pleaded guilty to criminal charges and paid $3 billion to the United States government. $3 billion. The largest healthcare fraud settlement in American history at that time. The charges included this. GlaxoSmithKline had promoted Paxil, their blockbuster antidepressant, for use in patients under 18 years old. Children, adolescents. The FDA had never approved Paxil for anyone under 18. GSK knew this. Their internal studies conducted by the company itself on pediatric patients, showed that Paxil was no more effective than a placebo in adolescents. And they showed something else. They showed an elevated rate of suicidal thinking in young patients taking the drug. GSK did not publish those results. They buried them for years. They continued marketing Paxil to pediatricians and child psychiatrists. Doctors prescribed it to children on the basis of positive trial data that was selected, shaped, and published by GSK's marketing department. The negative data, the data showing no benefit and possible harm, went into a file and stayed there until litigation forced it out. The internal study on Paxil in adolescents is known in the medical literature as Study 329. It was published in 2001 in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The published version concluded that Paxil was generally well tolerated and effective in adolescents. In 2015, a team of independent researchers reanalyzed the raw data GSK had been forced to release through litigation. Their reanalysis, published in the British Medical Journal, found the opposite conclusion. Not effective. Not well tolerated, and associated with a statistically significant increase in suicidal behavior. The same data, 2 analyses, 2 opposite conclusions. One made it into the medical literature when it mattered. The other came out 14 years later. Now, the detail men. GSK, exactly like Purdue, maintained a large pharmaceutical sales force. Exactly like Purdue, they paid performance bonuses tied to prescription volume. Exactly like Purdue,
They ran speaker programs, paying psychiatrists and pediatricians thousands of dollars per engagement to promote Paxil at educational dinners. One psychiatrist in New Jersey received more than $1 million from GSK in speaker fees between 2001 and 2010. $1 million to talk about their drug to his colleagues. $3 billion settlement, criminal guilty plea. GSK's CEO at the time of the settlement called the conduct deeply disappointing. He had joined GSK after the conduct occurred.
The executives who presided over it were gone. No one went to prison. That's Category 1. Category 2. Antipsychotics. Johnson & Johnson's drug Risperdal was approved by the FDA in 1993 for a specific condition: schizophrenia in adults. It works for that. It's a legitimate medicine for a severe illness. But Johnson & Johnson's sales team had other ideas. Starting in the late 90s and continuing through the 2000s, J&J sales reps promoted Risperdal for uses it was never approved for: dementia in elderly patients, behavioral problems in children, mood disorders, anxiety, conditions that have nothing to do with schizophrenia, conditions where an antipsychotic drug, a drug that blocks dopamine receptors in the brain, had never been tested for safety or efficacy. In elderly patients with dementia, Risperdal carried a documented risk, a real, measurable, statistically significant risk of death. Strokes, cardiovascular events. The FDA eventually added a black box warning, the strongest warning category available, stating that antipsychotics increased mortality in elderly patients with dementia-related psychosis. J&J continued marketing to nursing homes and geriatric care facilities during the period when this risk was known and being studied. In 2013, Johnson & Johnson pleaded guilty to a criminal misdemeanor and paid $2.2 billion. $2.2 billion. For a drug that killed elderly people in nursing homes. Criminal guilty plea. No senior executive faced criminal charges. Eli Lilly did the same thing with Zyprexa. Same class, same off-label strategy, same elderly patients. Settlement: $1.4 billion in 2009. At the time, the largest criminal fine ever paid by a corporation in American history. Beaten within 4 years by GlaxoSmithKline, and that record has since been beaten again. The fines keep getting larger. The conduct keeps happening. Category 3. And this is the one that nobody talks about. Benzodiazepines. Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, Ativan, Librium. These are the drugs Arthur Sackler helped sell to America in the 1960s. The drugs that created the first mass prescription addiction crisis this country ever experienced. The drugs that were then regulated more tightly, briefly, before the pharmaceutical industry figured out how to repackage the crisis as an anxiety epidemic. Today, roughly 92 million benzodiazepine prescriptions are dispensed every year in the United States. 92 million. More Americans take benzodiazepines than take any opioid painkiller. And benzodiazepines, this is documented, established, pharmacologically certain, cause physical dependence in a substantial portion of long-term users. The withdrawal from benzodiazepines can cause seizures. It can kill you. Opioid withdrawal is miserable. Benzo withdrawal can kill you. And yet the infrastructure of scrutiny that eventually surrounded opioid prescribing, the prescription drug monitoring programs, the dosing guidelines, the public attention, has barely touched benzodiazepine prescribing. Because nobody made a 50-minute documentary about it. Because the deaths look like different things: accidents, falls in elderly patients, suicide.
Because the crisis is diffuse and slow and doesn't have a clear villain with a family name. Yet. 3 categories, all documented, all settled, all still happening. And now, the cover page. The title of the McKinsey document. The 14-page framework. White background, black text, teal accent bars. Cross-category application. The document that investigators found in the 2023 litigation batch. Here's what it says on the cover. Chronic disease lifetime value optimization, a cross-category growth framework. Lifetime value. Let that land.
In retail, in e-commerce, in subscription businesses, in the consumer products industry, lifetime value is a standard business metric. Customer lifetime value, CLV. It calculates how much money a single customer will spend with a company over the entire duration of their relationship. Amazon knows yours. Netflix knows yours. Every airline and every credit card company knows yours. It's a legitimate business concept when you're selling streaming services or airline miles. When you're selling a drug, it means something different. Patient lifetime value, the term McKinsey used in a pharmaceutical context with pharmaceutical clients, is a calculation of how much money a single patient will generate for a drug company over the course of their illness. How many prescriptions? At what dosage escalation? Over how many years? Adjusted for the probability that they'll switch to a generic. Adjusted for copay structure. Adjusted for the likelihood that their doctor will increase the dose in response to tolerance. Depressed patients have high lifetime value because depression is often chronic and recurring. Patients with anxiety disorders have high lifetime value. Patients with chronic pain have high lifetime value. Patients who start a medication and cannot stop it because stopping it causes withdrawal, they have the highest lifetime value of all. They're called high adherence patients in the clinical literature. They take their medication every day, exactly as prescribed, for years. Because stopping hurts. Because their brain chemistry has reorganized itself around the drug. Because their doctor, who sees them for 12 minutes every 3 months, sees a stable patient and keeps renewing the prescription. That is what lifetime value optimization means when applied to human beings in chronic pain or chronic mental illness. That is what was in the document. That is what was templated. That is what was applied. Now I want to close the last loop, the one I opened at the very end of part 1 and have been building toward this entire video. The question was, were the 3 systems, Bayh-Dole, the FDA revolving door, the detail man army, were they designed to produce the opioid crisis? Or did they just happen to be available when someone needed them? Here's the honest answer, and it's more complicated than either option. No one designed the opioid crisis, not in the way a conspiracy is designed, not in a boardroom with a whiteboard and a plan with the word crisis written on it. The Sackler family did not set out to kill 500,000 Americans. They set out to make money, and they used every tool available to them to do it. But here's what was designed. The Bayh-Dole Act was designed by pharmaceutical industry lobbyists who spent enormous resources shaping the legislation to create the financial conditions that made drugs like OxyContin extraordinarily profitable. That was intentional. The revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry was not accidental. It was the predictable result of a regulatory system that draws its expert staff from the industry it regulates, pays them government salaries while they work for the government, and then watches them walk back to the private sector with institutional knowledge and relationships worth 10 times their government pay. That system was built deliberately.
through decades of lobbying against stronger post-government employment restrictions.
The Detail Man Army, 90,000 sales representatives, performance bonuses, speaker fees, gifts, dinners, free samples, was built by Arthur Sackler in the 1950s, refined over decades, and defended against every regulatory attempt to constrain it. The pharmaceutical industry spends more lobbying Congress than any other industry in America. Not most years, every single year. In 2022, the pharmaceutical and health products industry spent $372 million lobbying the federal government. $372 million in 1 year to make sure the systems stayed the way they were. So here's the real answer. The systems weren't designed to produce the opioid crisis specifically. They were designed to produce profit with minimal regulatory interference and minimal legal consequence. The opioid crisis was what happened when those systems encountered the Sackler family's OxyContin. But the systems themselves, the infrastructure, is still standing, exactly the way it was. And it will produce the next crisis with whatever drug comes next, because that's what it's designed to do. That is not a theory. That is what the evidence shows. Now, here's where I want to give you something. Not just more evidence of how bad this is, something real. Because if all of this, everything we've covered today, lands as nothing but horror, nothing but a story about power and money and death that's too big to do anything about, then I've failed. And I don't think it has to land that way. Because I've spent a lot of time in these documents and these court records and these congressional testimonies, and here is what I also found. It changes, slowly, but it changes. The opioid crisis produced something that almost never happens in American regulatory history. Real, structural consequences for pharmaceutical companies and, in one case, actual prison for an executive. The DEA's prescription drug monitoring systems, initially underfunded and ignored, now cover all 50 states and are genuinely used to identify outlier prescribers. The FDA, under sustained political and legal pressure, eventually pulled that misleading safety label from OxyContin in 2001, 5 years after approval, 6 years too late, but it happened. Purdue itself is bankrupt, dissolved, no longer operating. The Sackler name is coming off museum walls across the country as institutions return their money. The Louvre in Paris, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, the Tate in London. None of them wanted the money anymore. Not because it was illegal to keep it, because the public understood, finally, what the money was. And Study 329, the buried Paxil study that claimed to show efficacy in children while hiding the data showing harm. That study, 14 years later, was torn apart in public in the British Medical Journal by independent scientists who got access to the raw data because litigation forced disclosure. That happened because state attorneys general, elected officials accountable to voters, decided to keep pushing after the initial settlement. Because the public demanded it. Because enough people were paying attention that walking away became politically harder than continuing to fight. Attention is the mechanism. That's not a slogan. That's what the evidence shows. Every single reform in pharmaceutical regulation that has actually moved, prescription monitoring, black box warning requirements, mandatory clinical trial registration, the Sunshine Act requiring public disclosure of payments from pharmaceutical companies to doctors. Every one of them followed a period of sustained public attention to documented harm. Every one of them was fought by pharmaceutical industry lobbying until the political cost of fighting exceeded the financial cost of complying. The information is not secret. The court records are public. The FOIA documents are public.
The congressional testimony is on C-SPAN. Study 329 is in the British Medical Journal. The Massachusetts Attorney General's lawsuit, all 1,200 pages of it, is available to anyone with an internet connection. They're counting on you not reading it. That's the actual bet. Not that they can hide it forever, that you won't look. Look. That's what I'd ask you to do.
Not just with this story, with whatever they're telling you about the drugs you're currently taking or being offered. Ask what the clinical trial data actually shows, not the summary in the press release, the actual trial data, which is now, by law, supposed to be registered before the trial begins and published regardless of outcome. Ask whether your doctor received payments from the company that makes the drug being prescribed to you. That information is public. It's on a government website called Open Payments. You can look up any physician in America by name and see every dollar they received from every pharmaceutical company in every year since 2013. Every dollar, disclosed, public, available right now. Most people have never heard of that database. Most doctors don't know their patients can see it. Go look. Do your own research. Not on forums and not on social media. On the actual government database. On the actual court records. On the actual clinical trial data. The truth is right there. It's been sitting there. Now, I want to pull back. All the way back. Because we've been inside this story for a long time, and it's easy to lose the frame when you're this deep in the details. Here's the frame. What we've watched happen, from Arthur Sackler selling Valium as a lifestyle drug in the 1960s, to Curtis Wright signing a safety label he knew was unsupported, to the McKinsey partner writing emails about countering grieving mothers, to the Sackler family withdrawing $10.7 billion from a company they knew was about to collapse under the weight of what it had done. What connects all of these moments is not greed. Greed is too simple. Greed is almost too human. What connects them is the systematic removal of consequence. At every step, the system was engineered to make the cost of doing harm lower than the benefit of causing it. Curtis Wright's consequence was a government salary. He traded it for a salary 10 times larger. The consequence of misbranding OxyContin was a $634 million fine, paid in 2007, when OxyContin had already generated over $35 billion in revenue. The consequence of GSK hiding Study 329 was a $3 billion settlement, paid after the drug had run its patent and GSK had extracted all the profit available from it. The consequence of McKinsey advising companies on how to maximize drug sales to people who were clearly being harmed was a $573 million settlement with no admission of wrongdoing, no criminal charges, and no structural change to how McKinsey operates its pharmaceutical practice. Remove consequence. Maximize extraction. Litigate on the back end. Settle when the litigation becomes more expensive than the fine. Move on. That is the business model. It is not hidden. It is priced in. And the only thing in the historical record that has ever actually disrupted that model is the combination of sustained public attention and political will from elected officials who decided the political cost of inaction exceeded the cost of action. Every time, without exception. That is the mechanism. Nothing else has worked. You've just spent nearly 90 minutes understanding the most consequential pharmaceutical fraud story in American history. You understand the Bayh-Dole Act. You understand the revolving door. You understand what a detail man is and how the speaker program works, and what patient lifetime value optimization means, and why the benzo crisis is the next chapter of the story we've just been telling. That is not a small thing. Most of the people who will vote in the next election don't know any of it.
Most of the people who are currently being prescribed drugs with inadequate safety data don't know any of it. And the industry is counting on that not changing.
They're wrong. That's actually what the history shows. They're usually wrong about that, eventually. It just takes longer than it should. And in the gap between eventually and now, in that gap, people die. So, this video covered the pharmaceutical industry. It covered what happened when the machinery of drug development and drug sales was operated without sufficient accountability and with captured regulators. It covered the specific companies and specific people who made specific decisions. And it covered the system that made those decisions rational from a business standpoint. But there's a piece we didn't touch. A piece that is arguably more important than any of the companies, any of the executives, any of the drugs. The piece is the money that went somewhere else. Not into Sackler family accounts, not into McKinsey partner bonuses, into congressional campaign funds, into Senate PACs.
Into the political infrastructure that decides whether the laws that govern pharmaceutical companies get stronger or weaker, whether the FDA budget gets cut or expanded, whether prescription monitoring programs get funded or defunded, whether the Department of Justice gets the resources to actually prosecute pharmaceutical executives, or whether those resources quietly disappear in a committee nobody watches. There are names. There are specific names, specific amounts, specific pieces of legislation that were killed or weakened or delayed by specific votes from specific elected officials who received specific amounts of money from specific pharmaceutical companies. That information is public too. Federal Election Commission records, Open Secrets database. It's all there. Those names, those amounts, those votes, those bills that never passed. That's the next video.